poi planes. It is a concept that is absolutely fundamental to poi spinning, but what does it actually mean and what is the relevance for you and what you want to do with the prop? Drex here from Drex Factor Poi, bringing you the love of poi spinning and flow arts to benefit your body and brain, and today we are diving into planes, that most fundamental of poi ideas. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick shout out to the friends of the channel. Big thanks to Dark Monk, Flowfests, Flow Toys, Pyroterra Light Toys, LMF Props, Spinballs, and Ultra Poi for helping to make the videos on this channel possible. You can learn more about all these amazing companies and the work that they're doing to support flow artists like yourself by checking out the links that I've got down in the description of this video. So if you have spun poi at all, I am absolutely positive that you have encountered the word planes at some point. Whether it is somebody critiquing your planes or trying to figure out how to make your planes more straight and everything, this is a word that will come up whenever you get into the poi world. Whether it's people talking about the different kinds of planes we use with poi, or how we switch between planes, or how you can improve your control of your planes. There's a lot of different ground that we can explore here. So to start off with, let's just define the word planes. This is a term that we get from mathematics and specifically from geometry that basically boils down to thinking of a large, flat, two-dimensional surface that extends infinitely far. The key here is that basically it's a collection of points that all exist along that flat surface, but within a 3D space, that flat plane could be oriented any number of different ways. In addition, you can have multiple planes that are parallel to each other, or you can have multiple planes that intersect each other. Keep these two concepts in mind because they're going to become important as we dive in. Okay, so abstract concept, what bearing does this actually have on poi spinning? So when we spin our poi, we usually think of the head as tracing a path along one of these two-dimensional planes. Now, sometimes that plane might not be perfectly flat, or there might be multiple planes that we're going back and forth between, and we'll get into that. But for all intents and purposes, what I want you to focus on is if you're just spinning the poi around and everything, you're basically defining a plane with the route that that poi head takes as it moves around. And when it comes specifically to spinning poi and different tricks and everything, we have several different planes that come up really frequently. So interestingly enough, all of the major planes in which poi is spun correspond to one of the major planes that anatomists use to describe the human body as well as the bodies of other animals. First up, we have wheel plane, where the poi are spinning on either side of our body like a pair of wagon wheels. There's a specialized case of this plane that we sometimes call buzzsaw plane that involves taking a plane that bisects the body perfectly into symmetrical halves. This corresponds with the anatomical plane that's referred to as sagittal plane. There's also wall plane, where the poi head seems to spin in an invisible plane that is both vertical as well as at a perpendicular angle to wheel plane. You can think of this as being that the poi is spinning along a wall in front of you or behind you. This also corresponds to the anatomical plane referred to as coronal plane. Next, we have floor or horizontal plane, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's a poi plane that is parallel with either the ceiling or the floor. This also corresponds to the anatomical plane known as transverse plane. Now, this is a plane that doesn't get a whole lot of use in the poi world, but which I'm a huge fan of. And finally, we have a generalized category for diagonal planes that don't correspond to any of the other three major planes. There aren't a lot of poi tricks that make use of diagonal planes, but those that do are quite distinctive. And of course, it should be said that with our current approach to poi spinning and everything, we really tend to focus on wall plane, even taking tricks that we will originally learn in wheel plane and finding ways to make them work in a wall plane kind of place. The idea being that we want to show our audience the full profile of the plane as much as possible. Okay, so we have our definition of planes, and we've talked about what are some of the major planes that are used in poi spinning. Now we're going to talk about what happens when we have multiple planes. That is, how we transition back and forth between them. So the first type of plane transition that I'm willing to bet most people learn is something that we call plane bending. Now, generally speaking, plane bending happens between parallel planes, but there are some exceptions. So for example, every time you do TikToks or weaves, every time you do body tracers, you're basically transitioning back and forth between two parallel planes on either side of your body. And quite frankly, you can have as many of these parallel planes as you want to in creating a poi move and everything. We usually just work in an environment where there are two planes that are on opposite sides of the body, but there are also plenty of moves that involve having multiple planes all stacked together in a row. Examples of this include inversions as well as tangles, and pretty much any weave-based move that involves going through a buzzsaw plane, whether it be in vertical or horizontal planes. And of course, there are also cases where we are bending our poi poi back and forth between planes that are not parallel at all. One of the most popular use cases for this form of plane bending is what became popularly known as toroids. These involve moving the poi along the surface of what looks like a torus, that is a donut shape, and we just happen to be tracing out different lines across the surface of it. There are also a host of other individual tricks that have this same quality to them, and sometimes they trace around the surface of a torus and sometimes they don't. And sometimes we just generically refer to any plane bending move that switches back and forth between two planes as being a toroid, and sometimes they have specific names. If you want to go with something that is going to be a relatively safe way of talking about them, toroids is about as close as you're going to get, but keep your eyes peeled because that might evolve over time. In addition to plane bending, there's also another technique that we use called plane breaking. So the difference here is that when we use plane bending techniques, generally speaking, we're trying to alter the momentum of the poi as little as possible. We're just giving it a little bit of a nudge one way or another. When we use plane breaking techniques, we are trying to stop the momentum of the poi entirely before shifting which plane it's spinning in. This involves the use of a poi concept called a 0 point. You can think of a 0 point as being any point in which the poi completely loses momentum. This could be the end of a stall or either edge of a pendulum. There's also a third way to do this that is kind of poorly defined at this point, that basically involves just completely ignoring the momentum of the poi and moving it in a different direction. It's definitely a more advanced technique, and we don't really have a good way of describing it, but just know that it is an option, and more than likely you've employed it accidentally on an occasion or two. So probably the first example of plane breaking that we have from poi history involved the use of YUTA stalls. YUTA stalls are a technique invented by Japanese poi spinner Yuta Imamura that basically involved him doing pirouettes as he stalled his poi back and forth between vertical and horizontal planes. Later on, plane breaking came into a more generalized form through the work of a British poi spinner by the name of G. G took many of the flowers that we already knew and loved and figured out how to put them in a three-dimensional space. He did this by essentially turning all of the flower petals into stalls, and this allowed for unprecedented mobility and switching back and forth between horizontal and vertical planes. And now plane breaking has just become a ubiquitous part of the poi vocabulary, but I can remember a time when it was still new and revolutionary. Okay, so I have talked your ear off about the definition of poi planes, what all the different planes are, and the different ways we can switch between them and everything, but there's still one very big question unanswered right now. Why do we make such a big deal out of them? And there are two primary reasons why. The first, honestly, is practical. The better you are at keeping your plane stable and moving back and forth between parallel ones in a way that is controlled, the less likely it is that you're going to hit yourself with the poi. That becomes a pretty big deal over time, especially as you get into more advanced techniques. And the second is honestly just that the straighter and more in control of your planes you are, the more aesthetically pleasing your poi spinning actually is. See, it's one of those things that I have seen so many poi spinners come up that can do incredibly difficult tricks, but their planes may be wobbly or sloppy or what have you, and it just overall makes their technique look sloppy too. Whereas people that are spinning very simple tricks but are doing so with super clean planes automatically look more refined than their counterparts. So your mileage may vary on this one, but overall, the better you're able to control your planes, really, the more aesthetically pleasing your spinning is going to be overall. Okay, so with all that said, how exactly do we make sure that our planes are clean? Well, there are two primary exercises that I'm aware of and that I usually teach people, and I'll run you real briefly through each of them. So the first technique is called orbing or globing, and it's a technique that I actually learned from an old Nick Woolsey video. To do this exercise, you want to be shifting the planes of your poi around your hands, basically defining lines of longitude on an imaginary globe that the core of which is right at your hand. You want to try and keep your hands from moving too much as you do this, and instead focus on gaining control of the poi planes in each of these different orientations. You'll be shifting back and forth between wheel and wall plane as well as into that buzzsaw plane space. Another exercise I'm a big fan of essentially involves inverting the exercise that we just talked about. I'll show you how. So when you're doing orbing, the idea is that your body isn't moving, but the plane of the poi is. We can also do it the other way around. So say imagine that the poi is just going to be spinning in a single plane in the middle of the room. You can walk your body around it to get a feel for how all the different planar orientations are going to feel relative to your body. The trick here, of course, is that the plane of the poi doesn't move. You could, say, draw a straight line on the ground or find a seam in the concrete that you can keep your poi spinning over. You just just then walk your body around it. And I kind of prefer this latter exercise, if for no other reason than it kind of gets people thinking about the fact that the plane of the poi should stay in one place and it's your body that moves around it and everything. I think that in the long run, that is more helpful for developing the poi techniques that are currently thought of as being dominant in our culture and everything. Plus which, you know, it gets your body moving a little bit more. Though I will also say, with the way that I'm thinking about how we teach poi spinning these days, I think that learning plane control as a thing unto itself might not necessarily be a thing that people need to spend that much time on when they're beginners. You'll note the series that I did at the beginning of quarantine, taking people through the basics, never included a video on plane control. And the reason was that I very deliberately picked tricks that I knew would teach plane control in the process of people learning them. And I think that until you really know to ask about it, there's not necessarily a great reason to have somebody grinding away on trying to fix their planes. But that's just me. Is doing plane control exercises something that's absolutely essential for beginners to do? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and let me know if there are any other exercises for learning plane control that you think are really important. And of course, if you would like to learn plane control as part of the beginning of your poi journey, I would strongly recommend my Introduction to Poi course over at my learning site at learn.drexfactor.com. You can get access to that for a limited time by using the code PLANES at checkout to get yourself 50% off. Go check that out because it covers a lot of the fundamentals, and it does so in a really awesome and structured way. If you dug this video, please make sure to give it a like, comment, share, and subscribe in order to help my channel grow and help people find this content so that they can learn from it. And of course, a huge thank you, because this video would not exist without the kind contributions of these amazing folks right here. These are my Flow patrons over on Patreon, and they have made this video as well as all the videos on this channel possible, as well as the people who are listed down below as supporters in the description of this video and everything. If you are enjoying the work that I'm doing and you would like to sign up to support it, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/DrexFactorPoi and signing up. You can get early access to all of my content, as well as a say in what topics I tackle in the future. Plus, sometimes I upload some fun behind the scenes or extra content on there, so yeah, you should go check that out. Was plane control an integral part of how you learned how to spin poi? Was it something that you came at later? Is it something that you just never came to at all and decided that, despite what I'm saying right here, sloppy planes were not something that was necessarily that important for you to be able to get through your flow journey and everything? I'd love to hear all of it. Please let me know answers to all these down in the comments, as well as let me know if there are any topics that you would like to have me explain. Please and thank you, and I will see y'all later. Peace.